files of Los Angeles, digs into the old criminal cases to find out what are the true facts. There were so many interesting and sensational cases over the years. What was the detective's investigation? What did it reveal? And how did they catch the suspects? Then we go behind the scenes to look at the jury trial. What evidence was presented to the jury? And what was their finding? Then ultimately, we talk about the conclusion to the case and what happened to all the parties in it, from the judge, the attorneys, the suspects, as well as the victim witnesses. So let's get started on today's case. What are the facts? The two cases we're going to be talking about today are very important historically. They changed the law on stalking in the United States. And if it wasn't for these two cases, we wouldn't have a stalking law and people wouldn't be protected. So let's get started. What are the facts of these two big cases? It's the Stalking of the Stars, involving two separate cases, the Thresa Saldana case, as well as the Rebecca Schaeffer case. And it involves two separate defendants. One was Arthur Jackson, and then the other was Robert Bardo. Now, to begin with, Thresa Saldana, she was from New York, and she was in the acting business back there, and was doing very well on Broadway, but she thought it would be better for her career if she came to Los Angeles. So she and her husband moved to Los Angeles, and they settled in the West Hollywood area, got an apartment there, and we're going to direct your attention to the date of March 15th, 1982. It's most likely around 10 o'clock in the morning. She decides she's going to go to the market to do some shopping. So she walks out the front of her apartment complex, goes to the side where the cars are parked, and as she's walking up to her car, a man comes up from behind her, and he says, "Are you Thresa Saldana?" And she says, "Well, yes, I am." And all of a sudden he takes out a knife and he starts stabbing her. Stabs her numerous times, and she starts screaming. And there was a water delivery man in the apartment complex next door, hears the noise, comes running over, and then he jumps on top of the stabber, pulls the knife back, holds him in place, and holds him there until the deputy sheriffs arrive to arrest him. In the process, he was able to stab her over a dozen. It was maybe 20 times, deep wounds with this kitchen knife. Now, it was kind of interesting what Saldana said about this. She said as she's lying on the ground in the parking lot there, she looks up at the water delivery man, and she said, "Just as I felt the last of my strength slipped away, I looked up and I saw an angel. There behind the assailant was a tall, beautiful blonde man. As if in a slow motion, I saw him pull the attacker away from me." And that allowed her to survive. And she was taken to Cedars-Sinai Medical Center, most likely about 8 blocks away, not too far away. And then they put her in surgery immediately. And she had so many stab wounds. They didn't know how were they going to sew her up. As a matter of fact, they operated on her for several hours. They used over 26 pints of blood. So very, very serious injuries that she suffered as a result of it. Now, why are these attacks on celebrities? What's the point of it? It's interesting that celebrities, movie stars, they have fans, and the fans want to be part of the actor's life. And at some point they become obsessed with the life of the actor, and they start stalking him, following him around to be part of their life. And then the actors generally get tired of that after a while, and they reject the stalker, and that causes a violent reaction. And that's what happened in this case, unfortunately for Thresa Saldana. Now, back to her career. She did a number of movies at the time. I Want to Hold Your Hand was the first one, but the one she's better known for is The Raging Bull with Robert De Niro. And then she did a one with Sophia Loren in 1980. I think played her sister. But the one that got a lot of recognition was the movie Defiance in 1980. She did this with Jan Michael Vincent and got a lot of notoriety. And this Arthur Jackson saw that movie and he loved it. He got obsessed with it. And what caused him to react the way he did, she played this role, and for some reason he was fascinated by the character she played, and he wanted to be with her. And his logic was that he wanted to kill her. If he killed her and she died, she'd go to heaven, and he would be prosecuted, and he'd get the death penalty, and he'd be executed, and he would go to heaven too. His idea is the two of them would be together forever in heaven. Now this is his logic, his thinking. Now, where is he from? Well, it's kind of interesting. He's from Aberdeen, Scotland, 32-year-old, and he was so obsessed. He leaves Scotland and flies over to New York, gets a bus there, takes a bus across the United States to Los Angeles. He didn't know her address, but he tried to find out, and this just shows all the different people he contacted, her agent, her publicist. But it wasn't until he contacted a private investigator who went to DMV and got her address. So that's how he learned as to where she lived. Now, he was being prosecuted for attempt first-degree murder and assault with a deadly weapon, and she had to come to court to testify as to being attacked by him. Now, his defense, Markman, and he said, Jackson is a chronic, paranoid schizophrenic. And this is the definition of, he had all the symptoms, auditory hallucination, paranoia, bizarre delusion. All of this, fit the definition of Jackson. Now, at time of argument, in front of Judge Rittenband, the prosecution was arguing that it was attempted premeditated murder, and the defense was saying, no, it was attempted voluntary manslaughter, a lesser charge. So they waited for Rittenband to come in with a verdict, and he did. And he found that he was guilty of first-degree attempted murder. And this was good news for her. And then when it came up time for sentencing, she asked for the maximum. She was frightened to death of him, from the injuries that she suffered. And the judge gave Jackson 12 years in state prison. So that was the end of that case, and he went off to prison. But while he was at prison, he started writing threatening letters. And it was more threatening letters. And this is just one to show you an example how neat he wrote these threatening letters to people. And here in one he said, I shall give the signal to terrorist death squads to proceed with the murders of Thresa Saldana. And even more, as to his fixation on her, he went on, I, Arthur Jackson, am still here at Atascadero, meaning the state hospital. Then assassination targets, Thresa Saldana, will be focused on and their lives forfeited by the terrorist hit squads. Well, this just frightened Thresa Saldana because she knew he was going to get out on parole. But he was so fixated on doing harm to her. So it was decided to prosecute him for a crime called, it's 139, threat upon a victim. And here he communicates to a victim of a crime for which the person was convicted, and this is true here, a credible threat to use force, violence upon the person. So he was prosecuted for this, and at time of trial, these were the charges, and he's found guilty, and he's sentenced to 7 years. So, it reassured Thresa Saldana that he would be not being able to get to her because he was going to be in state prison for another 7 years. However, time went on, and he had a robbery homicide case out of England. It dated back to June 29, 1967, 15 years before she was attacked. He was involved in a robbery of a bank in London. And as he's running away, he turns around and shoots one of the people who's chasing after him. And that person is shot and killed. Now this just shows you the robbery that he was involved in. So, hand over what cash you have. My gun is loaded. A loaded gun's in my hand. This is a holdup. If you want to die, just go ahead and trick and delay me. You've got 10 seconds to fill it up right now. So the interesting thing was that Jackson, he admitted doing this robbery and shooting at the individual who was chasing after him. And the people from Scotland Yard came over. He just freely confessed to it. Yes, I did it. Yep, that I did 15 years earlier. So after he was found guilty of the 7 additional years that he served in California, he was returned to England, and there he pled guilty to manslaughter in the bank robbery murder, and he was committed to a psychiatric hospital. And there he remained until he died of heart failure in 2004. So that was the story of Arthur Jackson. And as far as Thresa Saldana, she went on with her career, and she wrote a book, Beyond Survival, and she became an advocate for victims of stalking. And she continued to do that until she died at 61 of pneumonia. And what was interesting about it, she was at Cedars-Sinai Hospital, where they saved her life, many years before. That's where she died of pneumonia. Now, what happened to the rescuer, the water bottle carrier? Well, his name was Jeffrey Finn, and the sheriff was so impressed with him, the sheriff made him a deputy sheriff, and I think he still works as a deputy sheriff for the Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department. So, what about the history of stalking? It goes back a long time, and many people remember the stalking of John Lennon back in 1980. Lennon and his wife had gone out for dinner, and they were returning to their apartment, and there's this guy standing out there. He's holding the Catcher in the Rye book, and he comes up and he shoots Lennon 4 times. This guy's name is Chapman. Just before that, an hour before, John Lennon had autographed a book for him. But he was very upset with Lennon because Lennon had made the statement the Beatles were bigger than Jesus, and that really upset Chapman. So he felt incumbent that he had to shoot and kill John Lennon. Now, same thing. He was psychotic, schizophrenic. He pled guilty to second-degree murder and was given 20 years in state prison. and he's been continually denied parole. Now, there's another stalking case, likewise famous. It involves Jodie Foster, and she was doing many different roles at the time, and she eventually enrolled in school in Yale, and there was this John Hinckley who was so impressed with her movies, he followed her all the way to Yale and was trying to impress her. How could he, with letters and flowers, but she continually rejected his advances. So this upset him, and then he thought, well, what I could do is if I assassinated the president, that would get her attention. And as a matter of fact, he was the one that shot President Reagan, and Reagan, the bullet ricocheted off the car door, and that was the one that hit Reagan in the chest. So Hinckley, had been stalking both President Carter as well as Reagan. The whole reason was to impress. The idea was to impress Jodie Foster. So he was found not guilty by reason of insanity and was sent to a mental hospital, where eventually he was released just recently. So a number of stalking cases, and now back to our story about, we've talked about Thresa Saldana. Now we want to talk about Rebecca Schaeffer. And this is 7 years difference between the two. Very similarities, but this one turned out to be deadly. So what is the story about it? Now, the stalker went to Rebecca Schaeffer's address. This is where she was living in West Hollywood. His name was Robert Bardo. He goes over there. He's left Tucson. He's traveled by bus over, found her place, and goes to the door and rings the doorbell. The intercom system was broken, so that Rebecca Schaeffer had to come all the way down to the front door to meet him. So she comes down, she meets him and talks to him, and was gracious, and he was so impressed to be in her presence there. But she was kind of in a hurry because she was going to do an audition for Francis Ford Coppola's The Godfather 3. So she wanted to, get back to her apartment, and she shook hands with Bardo and said, "Thank you for coming. I'm happy to meet you, but I've got to get going." So she leaves, goes back to her apartment, and Bardo leaves too. But it was most likely about 15 minutes later, he returned. He returned to the front door, rang the intercom, the doorbell, and he stepped it to the side, so there was no way that she could see it. So she had to come down all the way in her bathrobe, and she's looking around and can't see anybody. Then when she steps out the front door, he approaches, takes a gun out of a bag, and shoots her. And she screams, and she falls to the ground, and the neighbors come out, call the paramedics, and she's transported over to Cedars-Sinai Medical Center, the same where Saldana had gone. But that was 7 years earlier. Now she gets over there, and she's been shot, not stabbed, but it was a fatal shot, and there was no way they could save her. Anyway, what was her career? What was her claim to fame? Well, she was in the 17 magazine a number of times. She was a model, very attractive, and then she went back to New York and tried to get into Broadway and was doing a number of things in New York. She got in a TV series called My Sister Sam in 1986. It was a very popular one. She was the young one in it, and it did very well for several seasons. And Robert Bardo, he watched it. Now, what was his background? He was the youngest in a family. There was a lot of child abuse, and during his early years, he went to the mental hospital a couple of times. he became obsessed with her, and even in his bedroom, he had created a shrine for all of her posters. He was just totally obsessed with her as a TV star. Now, she appeared in another movie. It was called Class Struggle in Beverly Hills. And it had a scene in there where she was in a bed with a man. Nothing outrageous, no sex scene or anything, but she was in bed with a man. And this just outraged Bardo. And he felt that she had lost her innocence by playing that role in that bed with another man. And he felt the only thing that could be done was that she had to be killed. That was terrible what she had done. So she was finishing up this movie, The End of Innocence, which is kind of interesting. She finishes that movie, and that's when he comes over and is trying to find, where does she live? And again, the way he found out, he went to a private investigator who used the DMV to learn her address and gave the address to him, and that's why he went over there. So after he had shot her, he returned to Tucson, and he was wandering in the middle of the street, and the police caught him there, and he totally confessed. I shot her because she had lost her innocence. Now he was extradited back to California, and he was tried for murder, and he was convicted of murder, and his sentence was life without the possibility of parole. What it did is it changed the law in the state of California. The legislature eventually realized we needed a stalking law, and this was the law that was passed. The elements to it is any person who willfully, maliciously, and repeatedly follows or harasses another person and who makes a credible threat with the intent to place that person in reasonable fear of his or her safety is guilty of a crime, a felony. And the governor signed it. It went into law in 1991. All the other states adopted laws just like it. So now there was a stalking law that prosecutors could use. The other thing that changed was that the legislature passed a law where the DMV could not give out address information. So that ended in 1994. Now, as far as Rebecca Schaeffer, she's buried up in Oregon, and she was only 21 years old. What a shame, what a shame. Her fiance, he wrote a movie and produced a movie, and it was titled Moonlight Mile in 2002. And it was about Rebecca Schaeffer's life and about stalking. So I just want to do a comparison between these two cases. They were 7 years apart, but there was a lot of similarities in them. Both were actresses. Both had been back in New York. They came to LA and they settled in West Hollywood. As a matter of fact, their two apartments were only about 6 blocks away from each other, although they didn't know each other. Now, as far as the attackers, there was differences there, especially in the ages. But both of them were obsessed fans, and they came long distances to find their victims. And the same thing, they got the information as to their addresses through DMV. Both had mental problems. Now, in one case, Jackson used a knife, Bardo used a gun. And as far as the attacks, they're both, as I say, at West Hollywood apartment buildings. So there's similarities. Both victims were taken to Cedars-Sinai. Saldana survived, but Schaeffer did not. Now, what does it look like today as far as these crime scenes? I took these pictures of my wife and myself That was at Saldana's apartment. Still there, looks exactly the same. And the interesting thing was Rebecca Schaeffer's apartment, identical, hasn't changed. And the intercom doorbells are still broken, even all these years later. Now, this kind of gives us insight into the stalking of the stars. And I wrote a book called Celebrity Curse. You know, we think of being a celebrity, that would be great, but there's a downside to it. And I talk about different cases in here about stalking. Get my book, Celebrity Curse. So that's our story today, the Thresa Saldana case and the Rebecca Schaeffer case. Hopefully you found them interesting, and you'll join us again for another True Crime Files of Los Angeles by Ronald E. Bowers. And again, don't forget to subscribe to our podcast so you know when our next one's coming out. Generally, we have one out every Friday at 3 o'clock. So subscribe and you'll know for certain. See you next time.